Good afternoon. I am here to present to you about climate change and humans. My name is Cheyenne Smeaton. First, we'll talk about how will climate change affect humans. Climate change can affect humans in many different ways, but we are going to talk about 3 examples in specific. We're going to talk about water quality and quantity, food and nutritional security, and negative mental health outcomes. First, the water quality and quantity. In various areas, a rise in water temperatures will cause eutrophication and excess algal growth, which will decrease drinking water quality. Due to increased amounts of sediment or nutrient inputs from extreme storm events, the quality of drinking water sources like reservoirs and lakes may also become compromised. In order to combat the crisis, we can execute watershed management plans. Changes in precipitation and runoff timing, combined with increased temperatures due to climate change, may lead to declined reservoir water quality. Reservoir water quality can be maintained or improved by a collection of watershed management to reduce pollutant runoff and urge groundwater recharge and reservoir management methods such as lake aeration. Due to the algal growth becoming so rapid and increasing, when there is an abundance of algae growing in the water, it is limiting photosynthesis to get to other aquacultural plants, which can limit the purification process of the water. The food and nutritional security, due to climate change, higher concentrations of carbon dioxide is being produced. In plants, it reduces their protein, zinc, and iron content. It is roughly estimated that by 2050, about 175 million people will become zinc deficient and others will become protein deficient. Climate extremes will threaten fish populations as well, especially in areas like Southeast Asia. Fish populations can also be threatened. We can go back to the algae growth. This can also play a contribution because the algae growth is taking up the nitrogen that is in the water and taking up the oxygen that the fish need in order to survive in the water. Cattle, goats, and other livestock account for 36% of all drought-related losses. The crops make up the other 49%. Due to crops being harvested from high drought areas and transferred to humid storage facilities, there is an increased risk for fungal infestations and pests. When weather events like flooding from extreme rainfalls, it can also produce harmful mold on crops. The more that the climate changes rapidly on a constant basis, then the more that the food will go to waste. According to the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization, about 1/3 of the food produced by farmers is wasted and lost between the field and the market in low and middle income countries. In high income countries, a similar amount is wasted, however, it is between the market and the table, rather than the field and the market. The food system is a large contributor of greenhouse gases. About 21 to 37% of total greenhouse gas emissions are produced through the food system. Overall, the food losses will add to the climate crisis, and nothing will be done about the security or malnutrition levels. According to the definition of the Food and Agricultural Organization, otherwise known as FAO, the food security is stable when all people have physical and economic access to adequately amount and safe nutritious food, which will meet the dietary needs and their preferences. The negative mental health outcomes is increasing ambient temperatures will likely increase to rates of aggression and violent suicides. When warmer temperatures are present, that means that the increase of people becoming more aggressive and becoming depressed also increases. The prolonged droughts due to climate change can also lead to more number of farmer suicides. When there is droughts, it's hard to grow your crops. When you can't grow your crops or you're not growing enough of the crops, you then lose income, which can be very stressful. This can be an economic stress that leads to a mental health disorder like suicide. Changes in climate and global warming may require the population to migrate. This can also lead to acculturation stress. It can also lead to increased rates of physical illness, which would secondarily in hand lead to ecological distress. On the right-hand side, you can see an image. This image portrays how the mental health outcomes can be related to climate change and what the consequences are leading to the direct effects. You can see that climate change can happen from eco-anxiety, grief, and stress that a person can experience from climate change. The drivers can be from the burning of fossil fuels, and this is very poor for our mental health and leads to depression, anxiety, psychosis, dementia, and many more. It will then consequence of the climate change is heat waves and hot temperatures, firestorms, floods, food and water supply displacement, and migration. With all of these consequences, it can lead to the mental disorders, and the direct effects of these consequences through the physical health issues and the economic instability will lead to examples like suicide, PTSD, depression, anxiety, community health, grief, and many more. Next, we will talk about climate change affecting national economies. The U.S. economy would stand to lose between about 1% to 4% of GDP annually by the end of the century through effects to mortality, labor, and the energy sector alone under a high emission scenario. GDP stands for Gross Domestic Product. These effects, however, will not be felt equally throughout the country. The poorest third of the counties in the United States would experience a worse damaging cost effective to their income rather than the richest third of the counties in the United States. The lower poorest third of the counties would experience damages costing between 2 and 20% of the county's income under the high emissions scenario. Canada's economy will be slowing down by $25 billion every year. By 2025, this is expected to happen. The damages will cause extreme amounts of increased money to be lost every single year, which can be equivalent to 50 cents of projected gross domestic product. The low-income houses are going to suffer the most. However, all houses will see a decrease in their income. Low-income houses could see increased income losses up to 12% in a low-emission scenario and 19% in a high-emission scenario by the end of the century. Climate change is also going to take away many, many jobs. By the mid-century, we can see that this will be doubled, and we expect it to increase to about 2.9 million jobs by the end of the century. The important key is going to be adaptation. Adaptation is going to play a big role, and every dollar spent on adaptation is going to measure about $13 to $15 saved, which also includes both direct and indirect economy-wide benefits. When limiting further warming, while adapting to the warming, we are already paying off in advances like taking proactive adaptation measures. By taking the proactive adaptation measures, we are able to cut climate costs in half, and if these are combined with global mitigation measures, then we can cut it about 3/4 of the way. The impact of climate change has been forecasted to be the hardest hit for Asian economies. The impact of climate change has been forecasted to be the hardest hit on Asian economies, and this is with a 5.5% hit to the gross domestic product in the best case scenario and a 26.5% hit in a worst case scenario. Countries that will most negatively be impacted in Southeast Asia will be Malaysia, Thailand, India, and the Philippines and Indonesia. These are often the ones with the least resources to mitigate and adapt to the effects of global warming. Weather events like typhoons and floods are becoming more intense and frequent in Vietnam and the rest of Southeast Asia, and it is also the lead contributing cause of the climate change around those regions. The long coastlines and the heavy populated low-lying areas make home for their about 640 million people, which is also one of the world's most vulnerable to weather extremes and rising sea levels. This can also be associated with global warming. On average, the temperatures in Southeast Asia has increased every 10 years since 1960. This can be seen in Vietnam, Myanmar, the Philippines, and Thailand. These countries are also among the most affected by climate change in the past 2 decades. This is according to the Global Climate Risk Index. The economic impact could also be very devastating. According to the Asian Development Bank, it expects Southeast Asia to suffer big losses than most of the other regions in the world. The climate changes affecting the global economy is agricultural production increases due to population. The agricultural production needs to increase because there is a rapid rate of population increase in our world. In order to supply the population with food, it is possible with increased agricultural production that it is not always being sustainable. Increased agricultural production is also one of the main sources of greenhouse gas emissions, which is why when it is increased production, there is a high chance of unsustainable circumstances going on. The combination of the rapidly changing economic environment is also the competition for natural resources and the economic crisis have posed several challenges for agricultural and food companies. Agricultural is arguably one of the sectors which is most damaged by climate change. The food industry and the agricultural sector make a significant contribution to climate change, but there is no particular vulnerability to its effects. The technological progress goal is to mitigate climate change effects and also make it more important than ever to ensure that there is valuable and trained, skilled employees in these fields. According to contemporary evidence, it indicates that the climate change is already affecting the food security and agriculture in a way that makes it more difficult to eradicate famine and starvation. Famine is especially serious in countries where agricultural systems are more sensitive to precipitation and sudden changes in temperature, and where there is a high proportion of households with incomes strongly dependent on agriculture. It is also becoming increasingly difficult to sustainably feed humanity in adequate quantities and qualities. The wildfires and hurricanes. Climate disasters have cost North America $415 billion in the last 3 years. In 2017, Texas estimated losses from Hurricane Harvey were about $125 billion. And from Hurricane Sandy in 2012, it was about $71 billion in damages. Warmer temperatures and higher sea levels are known to enhance the intensity and destructiveness of these hurricanes. The infrastructure becomes destroyed due to rising sea levels. The sea level rise potentially leads to loss of assets, which roughly $2 to $5 trillion by the end of the 21st century. This loss can come to damage to housing, damage to airports on the coast, damage to docks, the railway line that runs up and down the East Coast, and much of this infrastructure will likely need to be repaired or replaced. The sea level rise could flood parts of the military bases along the east and the Gulf Coast for up to 3 months a year as soon as 2050. When the atmosphere warms, there can also affect the inland military installations near the rivers and start to overflow with the heavy precipitation as the atmosphere warms up. In extreme cases, like extreme weather events, it will necessitate more maintenance and repair for runways and roads, infrastructure, and equipment. Lastly, this is an example of a graph that I wanted to show the audience of how the climate change can affect the GDP, especially in the biggest economies. You can see that India, Russia, China, Brazil, and Italy and South Korea and Japan are all expected to decrease, while United States, France, Germany, United Kingdom, and Canada, the GDP expects to be increased in the impact of a 4 degrees Celsius temperature increase. This is also my works cited page, and I hope everybody enjoyed the lesson, and good luck this week. Have a great weekend. Thank you.